I think I need to say that first, but just letting you guys know this meeting is being recorded. Thank you, Jessica. I want to welcome everybody back. This is the day 2, session 3 of the Modeling User Conference. And in case you're curious what session you're in, it is it 2024 yet? Planning for the future. And so really what we want to talk about here is everything around our MTP SES. We're already getting started with the next MTP. As you probably heard from yesterday, really a lot of our updates, improvements, scenarios for the model, all of that is built around this 4-year MTP cycle. And this is really the start. So we're going to have some announcements, some things we don't know yet, but really we want to hear from you. And this is the time to have a good discussion before we're fully diving into the analysis itself. Just want to mention a couple quick Zoom items. The chat feature is available for any questions that you might have. Feel free to put those in the chat anytime, and we'll try to either address them. We're gonna have a lot of discussion time during this session, and we'll get to those questions. Also, I'd encourage any of you to participate. Like I mentioned, we'll have a few presenters, but this session we really have a lot of time to have a good discussion and dialogue. And so we'll be taking time throughout between each presenter and hopefully have some questions. Encourage you to use your videos. Definitely not required, but always good to see your faces, and it's helpful for this interaction in this virtual setting. So with that, I'm gonna just briefly talk about today's agenda. This is a 2-hour session, and just real quickly go over kind of what we're gonna talk about today. First, we're gonna have Clint Hoytson, who's he's our land use planning manager. He was the project manager for the last MTP, or the current MTP SCS, and he's gonna give a little bit of an overview on the MTP and then a little bit what we're moving towards this year. Next, we're going to have Jeannie Hong, who's leading the Bayshare update. She's also our GIS manager, and she's gonna give us a little bit of information on what we're already doing that Bayshare inventory and collection. Finally, we have Dov Kaden from our land use team, and he's going to be discussing some of the land use forecasting that goes into these updates. If you were at last year's conference, we had a land use workshop. There was a great dialogue of really 2-hour plus discussion on this topic itself. So I'm really excited that Dov's able to join us and hopefully can spark some good discussion again on this topic, because I think it's really important and really what feeds into the model itself on the land use side. And then finally, I'm going to be presenting on how we take all of the land use forecasting, the base inventory and the forecasts and build that into SACSIM, into the travel model, and really what that process is and where we're going next. So with that, I'm going to kick it off to Clint to get started and tell us a little bit about the MTP.
Thank you, Kyle. So as Kyle said, I'm Clint Holtzman, planning manager here, and I managed our 2020 update. And Binu Abraham, who has been on our modeling team in the past and did a lot of our modeling for previous MTPs, and has moved over and been doing a lot of ITS work. She will be managing our next MTP. She couldn't be here today. She had a conflict, so I'm covering this for her. But she is going to be managing the next 2024 MTP SES. So what I'm going to go through today is just kind of a quick overview of what the MTP. I know some of you here are very familiar with the MTP. Some of you might be new to it. So forgive me if some of this is redundant for those of you that are already familiar with our processes. So we adopted our last MTP, this 20-year planning document, in November of 2019. We update every 4 years. So the next update is going to be due in end of 2023, beginning of 2024. So just by way of a little bit of level setting, this is a 6-county plan. El Dorado and Placer County both adopt their own plans that we incorporate. They are the regional transportation planning agencies for those two counties. They do single county plans, but those plans are incorporated into our 6-county document. So the full region is what we're planning for. We're looking at future population, employment, housing growth. We are mapping out or laying out where we think that growth is likely to occur. And then we are sizing to fit a transportation network to meet future demands. So just kind of a quick tutorial of what the MTP-SCS is. In general, you can kind of look at it as these 5 components. We start with a long-range economic forecast. So that is where we get the future population, households, employment numbers that we're trying to plan for. This is a little bit different than the way the Department of Finance in California does it. We start with a national look at jobs. We look at what California's share of that national job numbers will be. We bring that down to our region's competitiveness, and then from there, we're looking at what that means in terms of populations, in terms of new households, and so that all forms kind of the backbone for what we're planning for over the next 20 years. Dov is going to talk about the land use forecast in more detail later, but then our next step after we get this long range forecast is to start investigating how and where growth is going to occur. Where are we going to accommodate all those homes? Where are we going to accommodate those jobs? And then what types of homes are we planning for in the future? And how are those going to change travel demand? And then what are the transportation investments we need to accommodate all of that growth? Something it's not terribly unique to the MTP, but it is an important aspect that you don't necessarily see in general plans or other visioning documents, is the plan has to be financially constrained. So we can only plan for the transportation investments that we can afford. So that doesn't necessarily, that oftentimes means you can't build all the transportation investments you think you need or that you would want. It is just what we can afford. So our current plan is about a $35 billion plan. Just by way of kind of giving you an idea of how much of a constraint that is. When we started the work on our last plan, on the 2020 plan, we go out to every city and every county, every transit agency in the region, and we are collecting their projects from them. We're asking, what is in your list of projects that you need us to consider for this next MTP? On just the roadway expansion projects, we got over $12 billion in potential projects. What is actually in the plan is about $6 billion. So that was more than double the amount that we actually had to play with over the next 20 years. On maintenance, it's an even bigger story. The amount of maintenance and rehabilitation needs that we have over the next 20 years are significantly higher than what we have to afford. So one of the things we look at when we're building our strategies for the plan and our policies and our strategies is how can we start to close our gaps? How can we be creative about financing mechanisms, about new revenues? We do have forecast for new revenues that may not be part of the portfolio of transportation dollars available today. In our 2020 plan, we introduced system pricing for the first time in our region. So we looked at tolling and we looked at a shift away from fuel taxes to mileage-based taxes, both as a demand management strategy, but also as a revenue generation strategy, because the fact is that we don't generate enough funding through traditional sources to pay for what we think we need on the system. So that's the transportation budget and investments. $35 billion budget, we match that with $35 billion worth of investments. And then we're looking at performance outcomes. Some of those are regional goals. They're reflective of our regional goals or local goals and priorities. But there are also federal and state requirements on our plan. And I'll get into that here in the next couple of slides. And then we have to back up all of our assertions, where we think housing is going to go, where we think jobs are going to go. Land use is a major driving factor in travel demand and how we are planning for our transportation network. And because SACOG doesn't have land use authority, we need to come in and back up all of our assertions about future land uses, future transportation investments through policies and strategies, things that SACOG can do to help, things that the region needs to do to help implement this plan. So I mentioned some of the performance requirements. This plan has to conform with the Federal Clean Air Act. The Sacramento region is not in attainment with the Clean Air Act. We have particulate matter, NOx, ozone precursors that exist in our region that are unhealthy for humans. So we need to clean that up over time. So part of what we use our travel model for is helping us determine how the future land use patterns and future transportation investments will help us clean our air so that we can be in compliance with the Clean Air Act. That is a critical part of every plan, and it is a requirement if we're going to continue to receive federal and state funding. And then within the state, I'm sure most of you are familiar or have heard of SB 375. So that was a state law that tasked MPOs like SACOG with reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The way that target works, it's a per capita target. We're benchmarked against 2005. This is passenger vehicles only, so it's tailpipe emissions. We're benchmarked against a 2005 in our 2012 and our 2016 SCSs, the first two SCSs affected by SB 375, we had a 16% reduction target. So we were trying to get to a 16% per capita reduction compared to 2005 by a target year of 2035. In the 2020 MTP, that target went up. It went up to 19%. And so that was it. That was actually a pretty meaningful and significant increase in our greenhouse gas target. It really, really made us buckle down and think about how we can create a plan that can hit that target. And that was a big challenge. It is part of why we brought pricing into the plan. We weren't seeing a path towards getting to 19% through just the combination of land use strategy and transportation investments alone. We needed to look beyond that to other management strategies. So ITS, TDM, operations, and then pricing as a management strategy. So what that all comes up to, and you'll get to hear a lot more about this in the upcoming presentations. We take our economic growth forecast, we turn that into a land use allocation or a land use forecast for the next at least 20 years. The plan has to be at least 20 years. Sometimes we'll go beyond that. We'll go to 25 or to 30 years even. And so that is something that we're still figuring out how we want to tackle that in this next plan. What do we want the horizon year to be? Dav will talk about the land use forecast. That land use forecast drives the travel demand that we see in our region. We work with local agencies, cities, counties, transit agencies. Caltrans is a huge partner on this to try to marry up a transportation and set of transportation investments to that land use forecast so that we can meet all of our regional objectives. So the required ones for clean air, for greenhouse gas reduction, but also the regional priorities, things like economic prosperity, quality of life, increasing housing options and housing affordability so that people can afford to live in the region, live and work in the region. All of these goals are something that we are striving for when we are matching up that transportation system with the land use forecast. So for the next plan, as Kyle kind of alluded to, we're in the kind of the beginning planning phases or the scoping phases for what is going to be included in the next MTP. I mentioned we're on track to adopt this by end of 2023, beginning of 2024. This year, what you're going to hear from Jeannie immediately after this year is focused largely on building our foundational assumptions. So by the end of this year, we want to have our complete base year. We want to understand our starting point for the next plan. We want to understand what our future growth is going to be. So we'll go about conducting that long range economic forecast. And then we'll begin figuring out, or by the end of the year, hopefully we will have figured out how are we going to test. So right now, I mean, just our current situation, the fact that we're here virtually, the last year of being at home, teleworking during this pandemic has kind of, we've known there is so much uncertainty when you're planning for 20 years into the future. This last year has really drilled that home. So we're looking at how can we be more nimble in testing scenarios in the next plan? What are our priorities going to be in the next plan? This is a particularly challenging time to try to focus on what the next 20 years hold, because we don't even know what the next 24 months holds. So we're exploring ways that we can maybe do additional scenario testing. Traditionally in the past, we've looked at, a handful, up to 3 different scenarios, sometimes a little bit more. And we've used the travel model as our vehicle for doing that. And the travel model will absolutely continue to play a role in that, but we're looking for other ways that we can test a wider variety and a higher number of future scenarios so that we can build in and look for resilience within our plan. If these different conditions change, have we built a plan that is resilient to multiple futures? We're exploring how we might be able to do that with the Rand Corporation. We're looking at some, we're doing some work with them to figure out if we can test, multiple hundreds, thousands of scenarios and do some stress testing on the plan. We're going to work with our board and our stakeholders, and then love to hear from any of you if you have insights on what you'd like to see in the next plan. But we'll be working with our board. What are our major priorities for the next plan? I think a couple things that I'm pretty confident will be critical components of the next plan is trying to do up our game on transportation project prioritization. Currently, if you land in the MTP, kind of all projects are generally treated equally in the MTP. We do a phasing analysis so that we're building transportation investments in a reasonable time frame to match our future land use forecast. But we really want to see if we can start figuring out what are our near-term priorities. What are the projects that we need to really start buckling down in the next 5 years? If we were going to go to the federal government for a stimulus ask, what are the 3 or the 4 or the 5 projects that have a real regional impact that we would want to prioritize? So I think we're going to try to up our game on how we prioritize projects within that transportation project list. Our funding that SACOG runs at every other year funding round. This year's funding round is wrapping up this next month. We're awarding close to $200 million worth of transportation dollars. Those funding rounds are really derived from the strategies and the policies of the MTP. We want to see if we can bring that nexus even closer in this next plan. The other thing that I'm pretty confident we can say we'll be trying to up our game on in the next plan is bringing equity more to the forefront of our planning process. The plan has requirements. We have to do a Title VI analysis. We have to look at environmental justice. But just meeting the letter of the law isn't quite sufficient to make sure that we are addressing generations worth of disinvestment in certain communities. So we need to look at how we're going to bring equity into the next plan in a much more meaningful way than maybe we have in the past. Those are 2 things that I'm pretty confident about. How we go about testing multiple scenarios, what our scenarios are they the traditional, you've got a more inward focused land use forecast and then a more widespread land use forecast, and you're looking at transportation needs for those 2 things, and you're measuring the benefits and the performance of both those things. That is how we've always done it in the past. That might still have a role going forward, but I think we need to broaden how we do our testing to look a lot more at resilience of the assumptions that we have and the investments that we're looking for. And then test a broader, wider set of potential futures. Those are all things that we'll be wrestling with over the next 9 months. Hopefully by the end of this year, by November of this year, our board will be in a position to adopt a policy framework for the next plan. That policy framework will say, okay, here are the priority things that we want you to look at. Here are the things we want you to test. Here is the general schedule for the next plan. Here's how you're going to do your outreach with your member agent, with our member agencies, our cities, our counties, our transit agencies. If we can get to that by the end of this year, that sets us up in 2022 to do most of our kind of scenario testing, outreach to local agencies to start getting our project list and our land use forecast dialed in. The kind of the meat of the testing and analysis happens in 2022. And then early into 2023 is when we want to start moving into our drafting our plan, doing our conformity analysis, doing our environmental document. The under SB 375, our plan can be used for streamlining purposes under CEQA. And so our environmental document is a critical vehicle in being able to do some tiering and things like that off of our plan. So we'll be wanting to start that work, and that usually takes about 9 months to get all of that work done. So it really has to happen kind of early spring of 2023. And then we're hoping to either adopt in November of 2023, which would be 4 years on the dot from when we adopted this plan. But we're also looking if we adopted this last plan a little bit early. We were trying to avoid some potential risks with changes in federal law, so we wanted to adopt early. Our typical session or our typical process, we would have adopted in February. We're hoping maybe we can push back and adopt this next plan in February of 2024. So that's kind of the level setting. That's what the plan is, what we know and what we don't know about the 2024 plan. But before I think Jeannie's coming up next. Before I hand it off to her, I wanted to see if any questions or if I went too fast, any clarifications needed on what I just went over. I see a couple questions in the chat. Molly, what are we thinking about approaches for bringing equity into the planning process? That's a fantastic question, and I don't have a fantastic answer for you yet. We did apply for some Caltrans assistance to do a transportation equity audit to look at how our transportation, the investments that we've made in the past through our funding rounds have had an impact on Black, Indigenous, and people of color and disadvantaged communities in our region. We don't know if we've got that yet, but that if we're able to get that grant, that could help inform some of that work. But that is something that we're absolutely exploring. And so we are by no means the experts in this. One thing we know about it is that if we're going to meaningfully bring equity into the next plan, we're going to need help. And so if just tapping the brain trust here, if there are ideas or examples or best practices that you've seen elsewhere in the state or the nation, we are on the lookout for that because we just don't know the answer on how we're going to do that just yet. Susan, green mobility hierarchy with the first priority as active transportation followed by transit and shared mobility, and finally zero emission vehicles. That's a good question as well. When I was talking about we want to really focus on transportation project prioritization, I think we need to figure out what exactly that's going to mean. So looking at kind of the Air District had a presentation last year where they were talking about no regret actions that you can build into transportation planning. If we can start kind of figuring out based on the very uncertain futures that we're looking at, what are the investments that we can make that really will improve mobility? And this plan is a mobility focused plan. It is not a how do we get the most throughput on our roads. It's not all about cars. This is about mobility and increasing transportation choice. So something like a mobility hierarchy is an interesting concept that we might be exploring when we start talking about how we're going to prioritize projects in the next plan. And Bruce just put into the chat a little more detail. If you're interested in the question Molly had about bringing equity into the next plan, Bruce provided a link to give you a little bit more reading on that. I don't.
Looks like there's one other question in the chat. Will SACOG work towards fostering electric vehicle adoption as part of the goals?
That's a good question. And in fact, we just talked with the Air District yesterday about how we might be able to partner looking at clean zero or near zero emission vehicle deployment. So electric vehicles, They are a part of our plan. We do get some benefit, especially when we're talking greenhouse gases. There is some benefit about that we get from electric vehicle deployment. I think I can't give you a yes, absolutely, we're going to do something big on electric vehicles, but it is absolutely something that we're already talking about and talking to the Air District right now, who Air District and SMUD and other stakeholders who maybe have a little bit more knowledge than we do internally. We're talking with them now to see maybe how we can work together on some near-term solutions for setting ourselves up for success when it comes to either electric or hydrogen, zero or near zero emission vehicle deployment. Did I miss any others? I'm not seeing. Oh,
Yeah, and this is great. I think this is a good discussion. Also, feel free at this time to unmute and ask Clint if you have any other further questions around the MTP.
As far as electric vehicle adoption as part of meeting our air quality attainment goals, I think the electric vehicle, Kyle or Bruce, correct me if this is wrong, because I think that this gets into modeling, but electric vehicles kind of get rolled into kind of average fuel economy, I believe. And so they do play a part in helping us meet our clean air goals. I will say though, I mentioned that we brought pricing into the latest plan. We don't count pricing and the travel demand benefits of like mileage-based fees. We're not counting those towards helping us meet our clean air goals just yet. There's an additional hurdle. We need to make sure that that's actually going to happen. Right now, it's a planning assumption. We don't want to base our future air quality on a planning assumption right now. We need to start. We're committed to trying to implement those pricing strategies, but we need to just get more traction behind those. And because that requires state and federal action potentially to get to a mileage-based pricing and a shift away from fuel taxes, those are not things that we're counting on as far as meeting our Clean Air Act requirements. They are part of our greenhouse gas solution, though. Kyle, have I missed any other questions? I don't think so.
I think you covered everything in at least in the chat.
Any other questions, either chat or from anyone else before I hand it off to Jeannie? And as you're hearing from the other presenters, you may come up with questions that kind of harken back to this. I'll be around, but bring those questions up later as well, and we can try to answer them there as well.
All right. Thank you very much, Clint. With that, I think Jeannie, if we can switch over to talk about the Bayshare inventory. And Clint just alluded to this, but I wanted to mention Clint's going to be here. He's available for questions, so feel free to drop those in the chat. And then we also have Tina Glover, who is our in-house demographer, and she really is an integral part of this Bayshare update. She knows a lot and keeps us up to date on what's happening with the census, the different data sources. Clint mentioned some differences already between DOF and how we do our planning. And so she's also going to be here to answer any questions in the chat as well as part of these discussions. So with that, looks like Jeannie, I can see your screen.
Good morning. Sorry, I guess I was muted.
Oh, shoot. Morning.
Can you see my presentation? Yes. Okay. Good morning. I'm here to talk to you about the Bayshare update for 2020. 2020 is the new base year that we have decided on. It is a snapshot of what we are looking at. So SACOG's process for creating a land use forecast for the next 2024 MTP begins with the Bayshare update. This update happens every 4 years and is, like I said, only a snapshot of time of housing for time for housing and employment estimates in the region. The Bayshare is the initial parcel level data set with housing units and employment numbers based on the best available information. And then compared and validated with other sources of data. After the data is compiled, the land use team begins creating and modeling forecast scenarios for the horizon year.
Hey, Jeannie,
Yes,
just real quick. Are you able to make the presentation slide full screen? We can see your notes and everything. And the other way we can do it is Jessica also has the slides and she could present. Yep, that worked.
okay.
Great.
So what we're showing for housing is that the first thing we do is grab the parcel and the parcel layer and the assessor data set. The SACOG yearly collects the county parcel boundaries and assessor data. We go in and clean the data every year. The GIS team will go and the GIS team will go and clean up topology and the geometry of the data, and then we will join the assessor data. What we're looking for normally is the land use and structure value and the land use codes. We use the land use codes to verify some of the data that's on there, and then we compile all the parcel layers, and then we start the estimates. And we compare that to the housing inventory. So our housing inventory is built on the 2010 decennial census housing counts at the block level. We go and make sure that everything looks okay, and then we'll go and ask, and we'll go and get the permit data and join it onto that parcel layer. The housing permit is something we ask for annually from the jurisdictions. We ask them for the finalized parcels, and we get them as sometimes as shape files in GIS and also in just a Excel spreadsheet. The staff will go in, clean all that data up, and then we will geocode everything, and then we'll take those files and put them onto the parcel layer, and we'll recalibrate it and create a housing inventory. We do this annually, so we do ask the jurisdictions annually for that. Here is an example of how we do allocation for the base year. We first take the clean parcel files and join all the 2016 base year points that we had previously done, and add it and join it to the parcel files. We use it as a base. We just want to see where the numbers are, and then we will go in and take the housing permit files and add those to the parcel files, and then do a comparison. So we build up the housing inventory to census blocks. So we have block counts. So as you can see, in this example, the blocks, there was 219 units. In the housing inventory, we know that there is a multifamily unit in there that had 200 total units. So we'll put that at the location that it's at. And then the other 19 units are single family. We just put that straight onto the parcels. This is an easy example of how we allocate for housing. There are some complications once we talk about multifamily duplexes and fourplexes. We need to go in, and staff normally takes a lot of time with the estimates here. We will use aerial photography to do a roof count sometimes, and we definitely use the Google Street View to make sure that we actually captured all the housing. Once we complete a draft of the housing estimates, we will do a comparison with Department of Finance numbers, total unit numbers for the jurisdictions and at county level. For employment, so we purchased, since Blueprint, we've purchased a data set every 4 years for the housing, for the employment inventory. They are point level data sets that have addresses, number of employees, and NAICS codes. We do an extensive cleaning of that data. We make sure that there is no, we try our best to make sure that there are no duplications in the data, and we investigate and try to see if we need to modify and delete some of the records. Once that is complete, we sum it all up, the number of employment by sectors. So for office or public, and then we sum it all up at the block level, and that becomes our employment inventory. We understand that there is no such thing as a perfect data set. There are, we have not found any that we can use as is. So with that cleanup, we also do other integrations and we go and research other sources of data. SACOG goes in, and we also look at schools, university, college employment. We look at medical facility employment. We look at state and local government, and we track large employers in the region, and we go in and fold that data back into that employment file. Once that is done, that is what we consider the employment inventory. Here is how we allocate the employment on there. At the block level group, so this example says that there are 200 employees. In the inventory, there were 10 points. This is the breakdown of what the employment sector splits were. Then we'll go in and go through our place types. They are generalized land uses that SACOG has created. We'll try to fit what we can, what is the best fit for that employment. And so we decided that that's going to be community commercial. This might be a little strip mall with a lot of different businesses on there. As you can see, we will allocate 200 employees. We'll allocate it to the parcels that are considered developed. We will not put employment on vacant parcels. So, but in this one, all of the whole block was developed. As you can see, the splits are a little bit different. This is what we have estimated. These are our, the way that we did our splits, and there's a little bit of difference. Obviously, there is no medical in this place type, but we try to capture it as close to possible as we can. Once we do this and all the allocation is done, we do comparisons with other data sets to kind of make sure that our numbers make sense. We do comparisons with the state of California EDD numbers, the census LEHD numbers, and the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. We'll do some comparisons to make sure that our inventory looks as, we just want to make sure that our numbers make sense. So some of the challenges and solutions that we've been thinking about and trying to come up with is that with housing, we know that the housing permits that are submitted are sometimes incomplete and inconsistent. A lot of the jurisdictions that we ask do not have the resources to maintain the housing permits, but this last year in California, all jurisdictions were required to submit their general plan annual progress report and their housing element annual progress report to the Office of Planning and Research and the Housing and Community Development Department by April 1st of each year. SACOG staff has offered to help those jurisdictions that need to fill out this form. And what we're hoping is that as the jurisdictions fill out this form, that we will just get a copy of this form and we will have a more uniform and more complete list of the housing permits. The housing permits every year is geocoded. We put them into our into a point file that is on the open data portal. You will find all the cumulative housing permits on our open data portal. On the employment side, we purchased these enormous data sets that need a lot of staff time in cleaning and in and making sure everything is deleted and that we incorporate all the other sources of data. And so this year we've asked the modeling team to maybe come up with new methods of automation and programmatic solutions. It hopefully will cut some time out for us, and we will, complete the Bayshare update a little bit more timely. The only things that we are looking towards for the Bayshare calendar is that in the 2020 census housing counts, in the 2020 census, the new housing count numbers will come out on September 30th of 2021. We will calibrate our housing estimates to that number. So it's another step that we will do to make sure that our housing numbers look correct. And then we expect a base year completion by December of 2021. And we will take these numbers and send them to the land use team, and they will use that for the new forecast scenarios. So this is my email address is on there, and so is the news. And the next presentation will be Dov Kaden, who will talk about the next base year forecast and the scenario building activities.
Great. Thank you, Jeannie. Any questions for Jeannie or Tina regarding this year's base year update before we move on to land use forecasting? I want to emphasize this is a really important part to what really goes into SACSIM. We have all those sub-employment categories at the parcel level, and really this is kind of the core of how we develop that inventory and where those employment numbers come from.
I have a question. This is Sean from Caltrans District 3. For the household, the parcel level, did you go to how can you get the exact number of household? Did you go to for example, if there's an apartment, so how can you know how many units over there? Did you call them, or you just go to the Google map? So that's my question.
The housing permits will come in with total units in there. So we trust that the jurisdictions are reporting the right number of units. So we will go use that housing number for multifamily housing. There are times where we have actually called the apartment units. We worked on an affordable housing database, and one of the things that we did was we did call them to make sure that our unit counts were correct.
Okay, so sounds very accurate.
Susan, you asked if the housing element annual progress report is publicly available. I believe it is. Dov, would you know?
Yeah, so those are sent directly to HCD, the State Department of Housing and Community Development. And as Jeannie said, we're sort of asking that they CC us on that. I don't know if the actual like spreadsheet itself is posted by HCD, but what they will be doing this year is kind of collecting everything and putting it into like a publicly available map that kind of displays the data in kind of an intuitive way. So as soon as that's available, we'd be happy to post it and or to share it, because I think it's a really cool data resource that they're putting together this cycle.
Hi, this is.
I'm sorry.
Oh.
Go ahead, Jimmy.
Yeah, thanks. I was wondering with the base year inventory and how the base year has typically been like 4 years behind when the MTP is approved. If that's still going to be the case, so representing 2020 and what the kind of ramifications are of having the inventory be like mid-pandemic versus slight post-pandemic.
So we decided this year that we would choose January of 2020. Normally we have an April ask for the employment data, but we knew that April this year would impact the inventory greatly. So we decided to go with January of 2020 for the Bayshare inventory for employment. We also will be getting a September 2021 new employment data. So we will have the opportunity to do some comparison and analysis on it. We unfortunately have tried before to get to a closer base year to adoption. On housing, every year we do the annual housing permits and we build the inventory, but for employment, it's been a really hard try for us to go and try to do more, to like try to find data on a yearly basis for employment. And it's just right now doesn't seem very feasible for SACOG to do.
Great. Well, that's still good to hear that there's going to be some pre and slight post comparisons.
Yes.
Al, do you mind if I weigh in a little bit on this response? Because I think it's a bigger issue than just unemployment, although that is a big one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a very, very important applicable.
Yeah, and Jimmy, thanks for the question. And Jeannie did spell out that we are going to be doing our main base year as pre-pandemic. Partly that's just a matter of practicality because the post-pandemic is still kind of crazy and it hasn't really settled out to anything. So we will have that as a base year, and it's sort of the 4-year base year update. We obviously recognize that there's a lot of change that is affecting the economy. It's affecting where people live. It's affecting how they work, how they go to school, all sorts of things. And we're not ignorant to the fact that we need to, with this MTP, address that issue explicitly in some way. But at this moment, Jimmy, we don't know how to do that. You know, some of our like one option is to try and create a new snapshot and have a new base year estimate and that we can use for a model run that captures sort of where things are maybe in 2021 or 2022 when things kind of normalize. We don't think that's a particularly good option because we still think it's going to be a moving target. So we are looking at other options for tracking what's happening since January 2020. Big data is one, not just replica, not just streetlight data, not just, but NPM-RDS data, traffic counts, transit volumes, all the data that kind of is routinely updated more regularly. There's employment data through EDD, and Tina could talk a lot more about how current that is to identify like where what's total employment in our region. I do think we're going to have to be adaptable and creative about how we capture what happened during the pandemic and how we're recovering, and make that a part of the plan update that Clint led off talking about. But we're still trying to figure it out in real time, and we'll do the best we can. We did mention a little bit in SB 743 that we do feel like big data is part of that solution to track in between the 4 years. I feel like there's an interest in a larger conversation on that. That's what came out of that panel yesterday, or that session yesterday. And we hope that it was a great question. I really do appreciate you thinking ahead, Jimmy. And we hope that you and others who have an interest in that will continue on and help us figure that out.
Great. Well, thanks for the update.
Thanks, Bruce. Any other questions for Jeannie or Tina? Or Tina, did you want to add anything on the employment inventory that Bruce mentioned?
Yeah, I think that that Jeannie and Bruce covered it really well. The only thing I would like to add is just that, through the whole MTP process, doing the base year update is really one of the first steps. And we've had people ask in the past, why can't we, if it's a 2024 plan, say, why can't we have 2022 or 2023 data? And, it really is our purpose is to try to get small area data as accurate as possible, so that feeds into our travel model data and everything else that goes on after the base year update. And so when we start building those calendars next to each other, we fast on trying to expedite a later base year. So for example, this last plan, the 2020 plan, we used a 2016 base year, and we had started a 2017 base year employment inventory, but then there were other factors that got in the way and minimized the time that we would have available to do that. So we wound up going with the 2016 base year. So it's less of what we have to do about it though, and more about the steps that have to take place after we get the base year update in place. So hopefully that explains a little bit of that gap. And the other thing I wanted to talk about briefly, and some of you I know have used our 2016 plan, where we used a 2012 base year. And in 2012, we were still in the recession. We had, we lagged so much around other regions and areas in the country. And so our employment numbers were really low in 2012. And we weren't able to update those until 2016, kind of on that same scale. And so a lot of people have asked us in the past, what happened here? Why did the jobs grow so much? It was just because our region had lost so many jobs, during the recessionary period, and they were just starting to come back in 2012. And so that was a part of our discussions in-house too, to look at doing a pre-pandemic employment inventory, and then take a look at something post that, while it might not be able to, or much of it might not be able to get put into this MTP, at least we'll have it as background information so that we can, keep those trends going forward. So if anybody has any questions, you can also email me, tglover@sacog.org. Thanks.
Thank you, Tina. I had one other point that I wanted to make, just because it came up, the question regarding how do we know how many units are in an apartment complex or something like that, and how is that related to our housing inventory? And I just wanted, since this is a travel modeling conference, I wanted to make this distinction, because this comes up a lot on what is in our housing inventory with the number of dwelling units compared to what is an input into our travel model, which is households. And the way that we go from dwelling units to number of households is really the primary adjustment is an occupancy rate, and we use an ACS occupancy rate at the tract level to determine the number of households that are within those dwelling units. So just wanted to clarify that distinction. Okay, well, thank you very much, Jeannie and Tina. If there's any other questions, feel free to continue asking those in chat. And I think with that, we'll move on to Dov Caden on land use forecasting.
All right. Everybody see my screen there? Looks like it. Yeah, okay. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Dov Caden. I work on the planning team here at SACOG. I'm going to be talking about the MTP land use forecast. So SACOG has been doing a parcel level land use scenario planning for a while now. About 20 years ago, before SB 375 existed, we started working on the blueprint, which in many ways was a precursor to the MTP SCS, not the MTP, but the SCS component, I guess, of our MTP. So fortunately, you know, we'd already kind of started diving into the creation of a pretty sophisticated land use model. It's still a pretty labor-intensive process each time, though. Essentially, the land use forecast, it's a constrained allocation of new homes and jobs over a 20-year period that when we pair it with the transportation investments in the MTP project list, it allows us to hit a greenhouse gas reduction target and our federal air quality targets as well. So we first start with a regional projection of jobs and homes over 20 years. And in our last plan, that forecast was for about 270,000 new jobs, 260,000 new homes by 2040. And just to be clear, that is significantly less than what the SACOG region has existing general plan capacity for. So this is, it's not a build out analysis. We take that forecast across the region and we allocate it down to the jurisdiction, to the neighborhood, and actually all the way down to the parcel level. So we are making choices about how much, what type of growth on every parcel in the region. So one important note to mention here is our MTP is not a general plan. If we modeled all of the general plan capacity across the region, it would probably yield double, maybe more of the growth that we are anticipating by 2040. So in that way, it's really not like a stapling exercise of all the general plans in the region. We're making calls on which growth to include. Clint set it up top, but you know, we do not have land use authority, right? That's an important thing to note. It's still up to cities and counties to zone for and approve projects. So we don't actually model a land use scenario that goes beyond what our local governments are currently planning for. This is a generalized map of what our land use scenario looks like from our most recent plan. We sort of divide up the region into these different, what we call community types that you can see here, just sort of as a framing for thinking about, you know, where growth happens. Most of our growth is happening in those red centers and corridors, and then the gray established communities. Those are kind of what we consider our infill areas. As you can see, though, we do have a decent amount of developing communities, which are shown there in purple. Those are like our greenfield areas. And you know, they're included there. Many of these greenfield areas, they're developing, whether or not it's good for hitting a greenhouse gas target or not. So, you know, we have to include projects that are for sure happening in a 20-year time frame, regardless of performance, to sort of hit a reasonableness threshold. So, how do we go about deciding what general plan capacity to include in the forecast, what not to include? This is a admittedly very busy table from our last plan. It goes through all of the factors that we think about when we decide where to model the growth. This is, it's in our plan, it's in Appendix D of our plan, along with a bunch of other materials and sort of documentation around our land use forecast, which if you are interested in getting into the weeds, I encourage you to check out. Rather than have you squint and look at this, I'm just gonna move on here. This is the simplified version, I think, of that table. And so when we go through and develop the land use scenario, it's this delicate balance between trying to be ambitious, but also trying to be achievable. We have a statutory obligation actually through SB 375 to be achievable, to be reasonable with our forecast. To do that, we consider a variety of regulatory and market factors. Like I mentioned, we're fortunate actually in our region in the sense that our region does have quite a bit of existing general plan capacity. So we are able to forecast almost all of our growth within the existing confines of what is already planned for in our jurisdictions. And that's not the case everywhere in the state. So we are sort of blessed with that. We look at local, we look at state, we look at federal entitlements. You know, some of these sort of greenfields require federal entitlements through habitat conservation plans. So, you know, obviously a greenfield specific plan that has all of their entitlements at all of those levels is more likely to be included than one that's still in a process. We also think a lot about market conditions. So places that have like a strong proximity to jobs, higher development activity, sort of trends in the past, those are places that are more likely to be included. Admittedly, you know, these market factors that you see here, they're sort of proxies, right, for market demand. I think I'll talk later about some work we're doing right now for our next plan to really dive a lot deeper into the market demand component and actually get into the dollar sign. So right now in our last plan, we used a lot of proxies, you know, proximity to jobs, certainly one of those. Infrastructure need, another one of those. So places that have strong infrastructure financing plans, maybe even already have backbone infrastructure, those are more likely to be included. And then the policy or performance piece is absolutely critical. You know, ultimately, one of the most important pieces of the MTP-SES is whether or not we can hit our greenhouse gas reduction target. Clint talked about how that target is actually getting sort of more aggressive as we go on. So we're always sort of thinking about what type of growth and where that growth would be that would best put us in a position to reach our target. And I think another way of thinking about that is that we're not really necessarily forecasting a business as usual land use scenario. We're trying to show what would need to happen within reason to actually hit our target. This is a map showing BMT across the region. So this is in 2040 from our last plan. The greener the area, the more likely that we are trying to model growth because of those performance reasons. So if there's you know, a vacant or an underutilized site in the green and there's no sort of unduly constraints happening, you know, we're likely assuming some sort of growth on those parcels. As it gets to be more yellow, more orange, where you have sort of higher VMT relative to the regional average, you know, we're going to be having to weigh the different considerations from that last slide and make some in-out decisions. So in terms of like how we actually go about doing the forecast, we use a tool called Envision Tomorrow to do the actual painting of growth onto parcels. Envision Tomorrow, it's an open source scenario planning tool. It typically runs as an ArcGIS extension. We actually have a customized online version running on our servers that we built about 4 years ago. We've used other scenario planning tools before, but we used Envision Tomorrow last time. We'll probably use it again this time. You can do a lot of different things with Envision Tomorrow. There's all kinds of functionality. We actually purely use it as a mechanism for painting units and jobs onto the parcels. And part of that is that we have an amazing travel modeling team that you know, we think can do a lot of the stuff that those sort of tools in Envision Tomorrow can do, but in a more sophisticated way once we hand it off. So again, we really just use this as kind of a way to paint growth efficiently across the region. Basically, we have this suite of place types, which these are regional sets of place types, which you can see on the left there. And each one of those has a units per acre and a jobs per acre profile. We sort of look at the map, we identify, you know, where are the pipeline projects, where are the vacant and underutilized sites. We look at what is allowed on the parcel, and based on, you know, the considerations that we talked about before, we choose which parcels to paint. Once a parcel is painted, I mentioned that each place type has a certain density intensity profile. They also each have a different employment mix profile. So however many jobs get modeled on that parcel, they get split into the different SAC-SIM employment categories. And when they're actually exported out of Envision Tomorrow, that's when that split happens. And then we sort of hand it over to Kyle and the travel modeling team to kind of do their magic. I do want to mention we have a Caltrans grant this cycle that is helping us do a full build out inventory. That's kind of happening in calendar year 2021. We've just got underway. It's going to be, I think, incredibly helpful for our next MTP land use forecast. As a part of that work, we're going to have an updated workbook with every land use designation in the region, in each jurisdiction, right, with density, intensity, FAR restrictions, a few others as well. So that includes all 28 jurisdiction level general plans, as well as all of the specific plans and master plans in each jurisdiction. From that, we're going to develop a sort of refined set of place types. We already have that regional set, which have sort of evolved over time that you saw earlier, but we're going to kind of do a reset on that this time, make sure that those still make sense, kind of build them into Envision Tomorrow again. And we'll have kind of a geodatabase that consolidates all of those different general plan, specific plan designations in each jurisdiction into like that single regional set of place types. So the end result here is that we're going to basically have, an unconstrained build out analysis that we would use as a starting point for our next MTP. And then I mentioned before, we're going to be diving a lot deeper into the market data as a part of this project. So they're going to be collecting, our consultant will be collecting rental lease rates, sales prices, production volumes, vacancy rates, all kinds of different financial characteristics. And then we'll kind of have summaries and reports for all the different submarkets in the region, which will eventually kind of feed into a residual land value analysis that's actually going to provide us with some insights into what areas actually have the most demand for new growth, where is sort of this growth going to be really financially feasible. And actually, as a part of that, we are going to have what we're calling a market-based capacity analysis that takes that unconstrained build-out analysis and actually pairs it back based on what is financially feasible to build. So I think that's really going to kind of help us with the that reasonableness and achievable component that we talked about before. So excited about having those tools at our disposal for the next updates. I think that's all I have for my presentation, but I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thanks, Dov. Any questions for Dov? I'm looking at the chat right now. We have one question. Is this Envision Tomorrow data available for non-SACOG staff to look at online?
So I guess it depends on what you mean by the Envision Tomorrow data. I think what we typically are sharing out is a lot of the outputs that come out of the land use forecast. We do share sometimes the sort of table that shows the different kind of assumptions of the different land use categories. The Envision Tomorrow, though, there's a huge workbook that kind of builds into the assumptions for each land use category. We typically don't share all of that just because we aren't really using it in the way that Envision Tomorrow was originally intended. We're not really thinking about a lot of the inputs in there that are included. So like Envision Tomorrow will have all kinds of assumptions around constraints and square footage and things like that. We actually do those a lot more manually. So yeah, we do share components of the Envision Tomorrow data, mostly the outputs.
And then the second part of that question was, will the build out be available in a geodatabase for agencies and consultants?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think so. I think there's going to be components that we will release. I think it'll be similar to the Envision Tomorrow type thing, where we're not going to just kind of do a huge data dump where we have all of the assumptions that go into it. But I think the outputs that come out of it, most notably what is allowed on each parcel, I think is something that we can share.
Another question from chat. Do you model or estimate induced land use growth in response to infrastructure scenarios, or are land use allocation considered to constant among scenarios?
So that is a really good question, and I actually would love to, if Bruce is willing to jump in to give some thoughts on this. But there is some iteration that happens. We will provide a land use scenario. So this kind of happens internally. It's not like as a part of a formal sort of back and forth where we're releasing different scenarios and then kind of iterating based on that. But it's more internal. We'll sort of provide a land use forecast to the modeling team. They will model and sort of attach it to a series of land use investments, and then they'll sort of feed back kind of the results of that, most notably the VMT performance, but also some of the other things. And so we will kind of make adjustments in the land use forecast to kind of account for some of the things that we see in the performance outcomes after the modeling team looks at it. But so it's a little bit of I think the answer is sort of, but it is not like we are, yeah, I mean, I think we're just considering the factors as we do the land use forecast. So it's not like an automated kind of thing where we're saying, oh, the access changes, therefore, there's this exact change in the land use forecast based on the access.
Yeah, and this last, thanks, Dav, and don't mind wading into this one. It's a complicated topic. We're not going to get through it in even with 2 hours today. But in this last plan, we did not re-up both the land use and transportation scenarios from the standpoint of like having a modeling scenario that we could run with different land uses and different transportation assumptions. We did do that in the prior two long range plan updates, and this last one we focused on other issues. We didn't feel like that was going to be that re-upping those scenarios, given that they had been done twice before, was going to add much compared to other issues that we had to engage, like pricing and other topics. All that said, the whole issue of induced growth, induced VMT, and they get used kind of interchangeably, although they are kind of different, is much bigger just because of right now, just because it's come up in SB 743 implementation a lot. And, we've put out documentation to CARB through our SCS submittal, and that's a shareable document, which we will post on our website. If it's not already there, I can't remember. So Kyle, if you can remember whether we've actually posted all that, I think it is posted on our website. But we'll also be posting Caltrans through their guidance on SB 743 implementation. They had a kind of a modeling checklist that's part of that, and it's obviously for Caltrans to be using a model for state highway purposes. It's an assessment that you go through. We went ahead and filled out that assessment and we will be providing that on the website this week as part of just trying to contribute to this dialogue on what does induced travel mean, and how do you assess its effects as part of a long range plan. Because our process of doing land use and growth is it's not like an integrated model like a PICUS or UrbanSim model. We do it through a really data-driven manual process that Dav explained. We do feel like that process does capture some of the dynamics of induced demand that shows up as induced demand or induced VMT. And we've done a fair amount of testing of our model with the land use forecasts that we produced to demonstrate that, and that was part of that SCS submittal. A lot of people do come in with the perspective that because you're not doing UrbanSim or you're not doing PICUS, you don't have induced demand in your model. I push back on that. I do think that it's possible to capture some of the dynamics of adding roadway capacity in areas where VMT is likely to be above average, and that's part of our growth. That's part of our SES. It just is the way that growth has happened in this region. You'd have to. It wouldn't be realistic to say none of that is going to happen. And it is part of both our growth allocation and part of the way we assemble the capacity projects that serve some of that growth. That's captured in the model and the allocation process we use. And when you measure the model VMT growth over time in our forecasts looking forward, there's a component that we think is creditable to what people call induced demand or induced VMT. We've made that argument, we've made that case. It's been accepted by CARB as part of our SES review. We also think that just having an integrated model doesn't mean you definitely induce demand. You still have to test your whole system to make sure that it actually does it. There's no way that any model system without explicit calibration, validation, and testing, you could say confidently, even if it's integrated with land use and transportation, would capture all that stuff and do induce demand. You still have to test that system for whether it does do all those things. I think this is a topic that's going to be returning to us again and again over the full extent of this plan update, partly because the whole dialogue around SB 370 or 743, and then in the scoping 27 scoping plan, there was this gap identified, a 6% gap in GHG reduction that CARB pretty much said it's got to come from VMT reductions. It's not with unknown, like the measures to actually get that additional VMT reduction are unknown. And the state said that they would initiate a dialogue, which would include the MPOs as well as a lot of other partners in this, to try and figure out how we close that gap. I think we're in a good position to contribute to that dialogue and debate. We're not sitting here saying that induced VMT is we're not making the argument that it's not part of our SCS. Our SCS includes growth and it includes highway capacity that reasonably results in some what people have called in research community and in the planning community induced VMT. And we just have to figure out how we do that, given that we're in a land use world where there's no absolute control. The market does drive a lot of decisions that people make, that developers make, that public jurisdictions make, and we certainly don't have control over all that. So it's a complicated question. But John, we took, like I said, in this last MTP update, we didn't have different scenarios both on land use and that we wedded together and prepared the results of. That's one of the topics that we need to return to, is whether we're going to do that as part of this MTP. And one of the things I'd want to ask this group is, do you think we need to?
So this is Dan Block at WSP. Just thinking of, as you were developing like this iterative process of developing the land use, as you're selecting the projects, I wonder if you have enough, or maybe you have a starting point and then maybe there could be some additional effort of some additional scenarios to kind of develop some SACOG region elasticity ranges that might be more reasonable than what's coming out of OPR for estimating induced demand for a given project, like, based on like a lane mile basis or something like that.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate the suggestion. And I do think there's a lot of focus on elasticities as a way of quantifying potential induced demand, induced VMT, induced growth. And we tried to put a different perspective, and Kyle, I see, shared a link for sure. We tried to put a little different perspective on how to use and interpret elasticities. We think if you can use an elasticity to estimate induced VMT, you can use an elasticity to test your model, and that's what we did. And that's what the link that Kyle provided is a link to, is just the documentation on that.
Yeah, I feel like we just covered a lot. So I'll try to get to a couple of the points, and I'm going to share one more link. But I think that Bruce touched on some of my first link was our Appendix E, which we submitted with the MTP. And really it's kind of discussing that point of induced demand, how we do our integrated land use and transportation process for this current plan. And that's in Appendix E. Bruce just mentioned that we looked at elasticities, and I'll send another link out in our model documentation. We have a sensitivity report that was submitted as part of our SCS, and we really look at the quite a few different elasticities, in particular to VMT and land use. And then the third part is we just posted. Bruce mentioned that Caltrans had put together an evaluation for using travel demand models on infrastructure Caltrans projects, and we kind of ran Saxon through that flow chart, and we put a link up for that as a SB 743 resource. So feel free to take a look at that. We're still we're working with our Caltrans partners locally at District 3 to do some evaluation, but we're hoping that will provide a kind of an additional tool and feeling comfortable in using the travel model for your projects. And you know, also there's the discussion of whether to use the calculator or the travel model, and you know, we think that it really depends on a project by project basis. And then finally on that question, Dov Caden actually has been, as one of the questions or feedback we heard from the last user conference was really looking at this integration of land use and transportation. The question is whether that's using a different modeling tool or whatnot. And Dov kind of led the effort on. We did reach out to a few different socioeconomic models. Urban Sim, I think, is kind of the forefront on that. We looked at PICUS, and then we reached out to quite a bit of peer MPOs on really what they're doing to integrate those land use and economics into their model. I think I'll let Dov speak to this a little bit, but my sense was we're actually doing a lot of this in-house at a more detailed level than the industry is at. But I'm interested to hear from this group, you know, if you've had any interaction with these models or you're using them for your projects. We're still continuing to look forward on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add on that yes, we are not. So we're probably going to use Envision tomorrow, this cycle again. I don't know if this is the right term, but like it's sort of, as Bruce said, much more manual, much more sort of deterministic than an actual socioeconomic model like Urban Sim or PICUS. I do think we capture, as Kyle said, a lot of the intent behind those things without actually having it run a true socioeconomic model. And then, you know, frankly, some of the feedback that we heard from the peer agencies that are sort of trying this route is that they're not like 100% confident yet that the induced demand question is being like answered, you know, in full and in 100% accuracy with a socioeconomic model. And Bruce kind of touched on that. And so I think we're still a little bit at the forefront of those types of tools and how effective they can be in capturing things like induced demand and actual like changes in access from transportation investments. I think it's something that we are definitely interested in, and I think in the long term, it's the direction we want to go. I think for this cycle, we made the determination that we weren't quite ready yet to jump to something like that. But again, I think we are interested in the future in pursuing that, and we're definitely watching that space, particularly as the sort of modeling and the technology gets better and better every day.
I have a question for you. Boundary. I think you have a parcel level and you also have a TAZ level. So the boundary sometimes there's overlap or not perfect to match each other. So how you guys gonna do with this? So because it is not perfect nested each other. So that's some error or some overlap household or household unit.
Yeah, so I think the simplest answer there is we use the parcel point to join it into the TAZ zones. We do for some of the VMT analysis and others, we do more of a proportion where if you're seeing a visualization of those transportation results, we'll split that up. But at the parcel level, we typically use the centroid, which is what's also an input to our travel demand model. There is some parcels that are in the Tahoe region. Those are not included in the SACOG region. So sometimes I think that is a little bit confusing to people. And then we are doing a bit of just cleanup, if you will, to the parcel file for this iteration. And Jeannie, if you want to talk about that, feel free. But in terms of the connection to the TAZs, I think that the simplest one is the parcel point.
You know what? I'm sorry, I did not hear the question. I have children demanding food right now.
If you just want to talk a little bit towards how we're cleaning up the parcel file for this next MTP.
The parcel files are, from the assessor, they've gotten better and better. And the only things that we really worry about for the parcel layer is the overlaps and the slivers and gaps that are in the parcel data. But so with the new census files coming out, the physical boundary files, we will probably do some work on the TAS file. We generally do when during a new census year. And we try to make sure that the TASs do not cut through parcels like they used to. And we will make sure and clean those files up that way. I hope that answers some of the questions.
But
okay, go ahead.
Sorry, Zhang. This is a general kind of plea to folks. If you see stuff like that, just send it back to Jeannie or Kyle, and let them know, and we'll include that in cleanup.
Okay, thank you.
This is David DKS. Is the plan to really detail out the parcel fabric and the TAZ fabric in some of the larger greenfield sites that we know are going to be developing specific plans, like North Precinct or some of the other areas, Jackson Corridor, Cordova Hills, all those areas that are within specific jurisdictions, but we know are heading towards are going through the environmental process right now, and to potentially make things a little bit easier for the different jurisdictions working on those projects. Or I guess the other part of the question is, will you be taking any input from modeling work that's been done for those projects to feed into the update in terms of parcel fabric and more importantly, TAZ fabric?
I can take a stab at that if I want to make sure I understand the question. But so first, high level, right, we're making in-out decisions on all of those specific plans in the greenfield areas, right? So some are included, some are not, based on a lot of the factors that I mentioned. For the ones that are going to end up being included, I think your question was, are we going to sort of parcelize them and kind of model them in a more detailed way than they're currently than the current parcel geographies are? Was that part of the question?
Yes.
Yes. So the answer is yes, and it's a great question. So we've approached this a few different ways in the past. There was a time where we did kind of what we called pseudo parcels and kind of divided these larger parcels into kind of smaller grid cells that were not necessarily reflective of the exact geographies of how the large parcels were going to be parcelized and subdivided as part of the specific plan. And then that has its own issues. In the last cycle, we on the land use forecast decided to not do pseudo parcels, and we left it at the larger parcel sizes, which makes it obviously a lot more difficult to try to like accurately reflect the land use plans in these areas with a painting tool like Envision Tomorrow. Fortunately, as part of the next plan, through this build out inventory work that I mentioned, we will be actually parcelizing the greenfield plans, and so we'll, it'll sort of be within one large parcel that'll be divided up into the different kind of areas and sort of land use designations within the specific plan or the master plan. And so it'll actually be kind of a reflection of how the area will be subdivided up in the future. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, that'll be really useful to both the local agencies and the consulting firms that are working with them, because, that's been one of the big struggles for us, is working with either the big parcel, the pseudo parcels, or the grid, and trying to make it fit. And I just think, make sure, I'd recommend that you make sure you talk to, the local agencies and or the consulting community, just on, which of those greenfield projects, if you're considering not including some, I would, humbly request that you ask some of the locals and some of the consulting group about, should we, is it okay, are you guys working on these projects, and should we include them? Because I mean, I think the more that you guys do on, not trying to put work in your lap, but the more that you guys do in terms of that, then the more consistency there'll be between, the different agencies and the different consulting firms on what we're doing.
Yeah, I appreciate those comments, and that's certainly our intention, is to work with all of the local agencies. I didn't really mention this in my presentation, but we do have quite a bit of interaction as we go about the land use forecast with our member agencies. It is definitely kind of a collaborative process, as we, especially, I mean, at the local level, the jurisdictions are going to know much better than us in some cases what projects are moving and what projects are not moving. And so that the sort of reasonableness and achievable portion is definitely like curated and assessed by the local governments.
And then to follow up on that, I'm assuming that, and I was the one who asked the question about the Envision Tomorrow earlier, but is there any possibility of, either agencies or the consulting firms working for the agencies to be able to do that painting process for certain projects to kind of ease in making our assumptions and our outputs and our inputs to the model more consistent with what SACOG is doing? You said it's open source, but I guess the question is, obviously the platform is open source, but the data and the parcel files that feed it and the assumptions that feed it. I mean, I know you said you're not planning on sharing all of it in a big data dump because it's too complicated, but is there a process is there any form of a process where the consulting firms or the agencies could do some of those painting exercises on projects to ease consistency of large greenfield sites with the model fabric?
Yeah, so in the past, we have not really had local governments or consulting agencies actually do painting themselves. We do a lot of consultation with our member agencies on, here are the assumptions that we're making. Do they feel right? Does this seem way off? That type of question. And we sort of walk through, area by area with each member agency. So we do try to do that. But I think we do still kind of want to have some sort of control ultimately on the types of assumptions that we make, again, because there is, we have, of course, we want it to be reasonable, achievable, and we want it to reflect, what is actually planned. We also have our own priorities, right, around sort of our policy goals, our performance goals. And so I think it's, again, kind of a balance between those two things. But I think,
And to be honest, I think if we had access to some of those painting tools, that would actually allow us to better conform with the, with the assumptions and strategies that you guys are going with. Because, I'm not asking about, being able to change the assumptions. It's more about being able to paint the land uses that are handed to us and go with the assumptions that are consistent with what you guys have been doing. So we're not creating monster spreadsheets on our own that might differ from what you guys are doing. And so, I mean, what I'm asking is actually more to potentially be in better conformity with what you guys are doing.
Yeah,
If that makes sense.
Kyle, do you mind if I weigh in real briefly on this one?
Yeah, go ahead. I think Jeannie had a comment on this too.
Oh, do you want to go first, Jeannie?
No, all I was going to say is, David, we can look into that. I mean, obviously before in previous MTPs, when we used other tools, we did give jurisdictions and the ability to just take their jurisdictional boundary files and be able to play with different scenario building, and was able to use the tool. So I've been out of this part of the MTP for quite a while. So we'll find out. Dov, we'll try to figure out if that is a possibility, because we've done it before. I'm just not sure what the capability of Envision Tomorrow is, but we can always look into it.
Because I think anything we can do, and I think we talked quite a bit about this at the last user conference, is, it's these big greenfield specific plans that are, causing the most angst, I think, for us. I think Jimmy and others will, would truly concur with me on that, they're causing the biggest workloads, the biggest budgets, and, and schedule issues and all that kind of fun stuff. But, if we could all work off the same page and, use similar methodologies that are as close as possible to SACOG, I just, we don't want to ask SACOG to do all the planning for all the agencies and plan all these, greenfield sites. But if we can work together to make the playing field as, even as possible for, what the starting points are and the methodology, I just think it would result in a lot more consistency between studies. And I think, if you talk to DKS or Farron Piers or Kimley Horn or anybody else, I think any of the consulting firms in the area would jump at the opportunity to work, with you guys on that. Sorry,
Yeah,
Bruce, I know you had something to say.
Yeah, and
No,
I
thanks,
just
David.
I
Go
wanted to
ahead,
make
Bruce.
yeah, I was just wanted to make sure that Dov and Dave knew there were a little bit of talking past each other, because I think Dov was talking about developing the plan, and Dave was really talking about doing, say, a traffic study for a specific plan or something that is based on that starting point that from the last adopted plan, and just wanting to detail that. And we heard a fair amount of that in session 2. We heard it last year, and I don't want to get too focused on that right now, but Kyle, I know, wants to come back at the end of this and have a larger discussion about, like, where do we need to focus our work. And we're definitely hearing that doing stuff to make it a little bit easier for folks to take all the stuff that we do with the plans and use it is a value for sure.
And I think that build out scenario is going to be, I'm really excited to hear that you guys are working on that, because I think that's going to be huge for all of us.
Yeah. Well, I think this has been a good discussion. I'm going to move us on for just time's sake, but really appreciate all of the discussion. I think if you have any additional questions on the land use forecasting or the build out project, please feel free to contact us or drop it in the chat, and we'll be sure to follow up. But I do want to get to the last part of this, which is really how we take that land use and we build it into the travel demand model. So let me share my screen. Can everyone see my slides? Can I get a thumbs up or thumbs down? Okay, great. So this has kind of been an evolving topic. We had some workshops on this. There's been some discussion, I know, on session 1, and really what I'm going to talk about is somewhat in the weeds, but it's how we take that Bayshare inventory that Jeannie talked about, the land use forecasting for the horizon year that Dov talked about, and how we build that into modeling it, in particular into SACSIM 19, and then what additional processing that we need to do for doing an update of the land use inputs into the travel demand model. And this topic is, as Dov already pointed, he already had some pretty detailed spreadsheets, and I think you guys might be getting this. We kind of started from high level, what are the goals of the MTP? And now we are going a bit into the weeds of how do we really do this analysis? How do we do these calculations and input this to ultimately get performance metrics out, such as green VMT and then ultimately GHGs. And I think we didn't do a poll in this group, but from the previous 2 polls, there's a lot of member agency planners, and there's a lot of consultants that I would describe as engineer or planning practitioners that use this model in this data. And for some of you, we've done these detailed trainings, and other ones this might be new. What I'm hoping that we can get out of this, I'm going to show some detailed flowcharts, but it's really just to get a better understanding of when someone says, okay, we're updating the land use in the travel model, what does that entail? And just being kind of I want everybody to come out of this having an understanding of being able to ask the right questions and just having a little bit more familiarity, and don't want this to look like a black magical box as sometimes people describe the travel model. Again, I'll have these slides to reference afterwards, and I may jump through a few of these for the sake of time relatively quickly, but we're also going to bring up this topic again in tomorrow's session, in session 5, in the nuts and bolts. So Dov talked a little bit about how we do this land use forecast. We look at the local plans, policies, regulations, in particular regarding our MTP policies, and then really what is the market forces, and that's what kind of drives that land use forecast. Dov also touched on currently we're using the Envision Tomorrow tool. This is a tool that we use for really the painting by place type. We have this community types, and it's part of, but not the entire way that we do the land use forecasting. So this is one of the scary flowcharts that I was bringing up. This is how our travel model interacts with the land use files, and I want to just walk through this because I think it's really helpful to just get a better understanding of how we take that land use employment and dwelling unit inventory, and then we transfer that into really our land use inputs that the travel model can use, as well as the additional pieces that we use to develop a households and population, which feed into the travel demand model. So I have highlighted here on the top left the base parcel data. This is what we get from the land use team when we have the sub-employment categories, as well as the number of dwelling units. And we have this at the parcel level. This is consistent from the base inventory, as Jeannie described, and also consistent with how once we have the forecasted employment and household categories. What SACSIM, our travel demand model, looks at is one, the parcel data file, where it not only has the employment categories and the households, but it also has what we call these point-to-point shortest path files. So really what this is this is the relationship, the distance between each parcel and really their relationship to the transportation structure. So we look at intersection density, proximity to roadways, and then really relationship, the distance between those households and those employment centers. And so that's what actually feeds into the parcel data file. So when we talk about we talk about circuity buffering, and that's kind of the technical term to just really, we're building the relationship between these land uses using the transportation structure that's existing. And then the second input is the population itself. I mentioned yesterday that SACSIM is an activity-based model. One of the key differences here is between a typical four-step traditional travel model compared to an activity-based model is that we really are using a population. It's a synthetic or a representative population, but we have an agent representing each individual person and households travel throughout the model. So that's really key. And it's also one of the inputs that needs to be built prior to running the model itself. And then DaySim is the submodule that really does this activity simulation, and that's ultimately what we're trying to build these files for. So part of the work is you build a synthetic population, you build the parcel data set, and then we just need to take these files and do a bit of formatting to fit into the proper input structure that DaySim requires. So when we talk about the land use processing before DaySim, we call these, a lot of the time it's the land use pre-processing tool. We have kind of three main tools that we talk about. There's an allocation tool, which is really, it's taking that household and providing and assigning it a location to the parcels. We have the PopGen tool, and that is our tool that we use to develop a synthetic population. There's many other population synthesizers out there. This is the one that we're currently using, PopGen 1.1. It's an open source tool developed by ASU. It has a graphic user interface, and we've been using it. We're looking at others. There's a wide variety of other population synthesizers out there that we're looking at. In my experience and research so far, they're typically they're going in the route of you have more capabilities, but it's more programming and more not pretty interfaces. And so there's always this balance on do we want more capabilities and customization, or do we want this to be user friendly? And currently the current PopGen has a nice graphic user interface that people are able to use. And then finally, we talk about this buffering tool, and really that's how do we build the parcel to parcel point relationship, pairing the transportation and the land use. That's a key part to really the foundation of how SACSIM works. And the buffering tool is a standalone tool developed by RSG that we use to really pair these inputs together. We heard yesterday that there's some requests, and we've heard this from other times that the last session, that there's some requests to how do we streamline this process, and how can we do this? And really, I think when someone's talking about this, they're talking about the processing of the data. So they're talking about, okay, we used the synthetic population synthesizer, and now we need to get this into the proper format to use in the travel demand model. And same thing, we have our scenario of parcels, and how do we bring this into the same format that DaySim's using? And so what I'm calling these is kind of our processing portions, where this is how do we connect the parcel file to in the households, and we allocate those parcels to the households. So this is a lot of data processing. There's a lot of different ways you can do this. We initially had been doing this using a lot of database servers and SQL servers. We then migrated that over to Python, and then the latest set we've heard is we're working on basically build these into spreadsheets. And really this is us just hearing from the community that there's a wide range of requests of how best to analyze these data sets and preferences. But I want to emphasize that there's no right or wrong way. There's just available tools to process this data. And we're working on basically providing a wide range of streamlining options to do that. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that today, but then get into it in more detail tomorrow. So this is another big scary flow chart, but I want to connect the relationship to really the flow chart of how do we take this land use inputs and we integrate them into SACSIM. And then this is more of a processing flow chart. So this is how you can see on the top left, this is our Envision Tomorrow land use parcel, how then we take that and we ultimately get to running into the DaySim. So some of you have participated in trainings on how to do this with SACSIM with me. I should mention that Yame and I are always open to these trainings, and if you want basically further information on how to utilize these tools and prepare your project inputs, to feel free to reach out to us. This is something that we've committed to, and we're going to continue to provide trainings in the future. And then I have these pink lines you can see, and this is really that processing and preparation to run these tools. So hopefully that kind of connects what people talk about when they say they need to prepare the land use for SACSIM. They're connecting the relationship between the different transportation and land uses through this buffering process. They're developing a synthetic population through what we have for PopGen right now, and then they're allocating that population to the particular parcels. And the steps in between are really just processing that data. So getting a little bit into what this security buffering tool is, like I mentioned, this is a standalone tool. RSG developed this tool, who they also have, I'm not sure they developed, but they developed the latest version of DaySim and maintain it. There's also additional documentation on this tool, not only on our website, but you can also check out RSG's website and GitHub for additional information on the details of this tool. So this is kind of a detailed look at what is actually going into the tool itself. We have the employment subcategories that we discussed, and as well as we look at students and households, and then the land use type code. This is basically we take the place type codes that Dov described, and for anywhere that there's residential density, we convert that into 6 density categories to understand that density relationship to the employment. The other inputs on here is we look at parking, any parking data at the daily or hourly parking spaces, or parking price. And that's really what's kind of the core input into the tool itself. The other part that's added to this is the transportation factors. So we look at intersection density around the project. We use a centerline file, so we're really calculating the number of intersections and the type of intersection, where we're a gridded, more dense area compared to, say, a suburban lollipop area that might have farther distances. We look at the type of transit, whether it's light rail or local bus, and then their stops and what is the relationship and distance to the land use itself. We also look at open space as another driver for destinations, and then finally that parcel file that I mentioned. The final portion that's not listed here is really we call it a security factor file, but I think the best way to think about this is it's a proxy for a roadway network to determine not just the Euclidean distance or the straight line distance to one parcel to the next, but instead utilizing the roadway distance. And so in this example here, you can see that previously where we had just a a straight buffer radius, all of these parcels would be identified as being within that 1.5 mile radius. But what we see is there's some barriers here. In this particular case, there's a freeway interchange, and so it would take much longer to get from one neighborhood to the next because of this. So everywhere that's highlighted in that light turquoise color, the latest buffering tool would remove those, and you can see it only selects the parcels that are closer to taking a more realistic route from parcel to parcel using the roadway network. So we do use, there's a lot of discussion on the TAZs. I think we talked about that, and we're going to actually be updating these, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But the core relationship and core portion of SACSIM that builds that relationship is at the parcel level and looking at these distances and their relationship to the transportation infrastructure. So the second part that I mentioned is how we develop that representative population. And I'm gonna jump through this because I see that we're running out of time. But I mentioned a little bit last time that we build the population and the demographic data based on ACS PUM samples and the at the track level, the 5-year ACS averages. And like I mentioned, currently we have this user interface, but we're looking at potentially updating this. So I'd be interested to hear from the group if there's any recommendations on synthesizers that you're using for other projects. And then finally, I want to announce that we're having these processing tools, and we'll talk a little bit about this tomorrow. But we not only have basically updated our documentation on this, but we've also provided user guides in that documentation, as well as scripts that are available for everybody to use that are written in Python and SQL Server. And finally, the last thing we did was provide an additional user guide where we build this out for project level evaluation, because we know that's a lot of how the local jurisdictions are using the model, and providing spreadsheets as templates and that you can use to develop your own processing spreadsheet for this work. So to reiterate this, we have done a bit of streamlining to make this data readily available. There's we haven't put it in a nice user interface to increase performance. This is a larger task that we just don't have the resources to do yet. But also, since the last conference, we really worked on putting the model documentation together and heard that there needed to be more user guides, as well as project and planning level technical support. And so we're going to continue doing this. I know we're at time, but I'm available for any additional questions afterwards. I want to check the chat real quick. And I want to provide Shingy just a quick update, some time to talk about what we're going to do for the next one. So I'm sorry that we ran out of time on this, but like I said, we're going to bring this back up into session 5. Shingy, do you want to give a quick update of what we're going to start at 1 o'clock?
Sure. Thank you, Cal. So hopefully you all enjoyed session 3 as the moderator of session 4. I encourage you to join session 4 so that you can get more information about the data services SACOG has been provided. So the session 5 will have 5 presentations and 2 Q&A sessions. The first presentation will be done by P. Atwood, and he will introduce SACOG's Open Data Portal and what is included in Open Data Portal and how to access it. So Tina Glover will introduce the Data Information Center. This is the SACOG data clearinghouse. So what kind of data in it, and then she will also give a quick introduction about the 2020 census data. And the third presentation will be MTP modeling data, and Cal will give you a brief introduction. And Durham County we're giving an introduction about additional data and the tools SACOG are using and we're use. Saying out, that's me. We're give introduction about a replica platform. So this is the SACOG is partnering with Caltrans and the CARB. It's the pilot project. So hopefully through this session, you will have the good knowledge about the data services SACOG can provide it to all of you. And then we do want to hear from you about our data services so that we can do a better job in the future. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Shangy. So yeah, like I mentioned before, check out the Zoom session 4 link, and we'll see you guys all back at 1. I'm gonna stay on the call for a little bit longer to answer any questions. Again, I'm sorry that we went over, but I think we had a lot of good discussion on the land use side, and I think that was really the key topic that we wanted to bring up in this session. So for those of you that want to stay on, I'm here to answer any questions, and if not, we'll see you in session 4. And thanks for coming. Daniel, I see a wave.
Hey, Kyle, it's Jimmy again. I had a question on the population synthesizer and the information available from like the PUMS data is, and just looking at, you know, how like in some of the origin destination studies in comparison with replica, that some of the other person just attributes that we could take a look into more on the environmental justice side of things, such as like race or any other factors. Is that something that is included in the data set and subsequently could be included in the person attribute file for the future like updates?
So I think if I'm understanding this correctly, the question is attributes such as age or race included in the person attribute file? Is that correct?
Yeah, I know that age is
okay
right now, but I don't think race is at the
yeah. So they're in the input file that is the ACS Bayshare attributes from that 2011 to 2016 average is included, and it does include race and ethnicity attributes. But I do want to preface that we did not do any calibration or any detailed vetting of that. It comes directly from the ACS Bayshare, but it is part of the files that we can provide you. I would just caution on using it for any future year growth because there's no control totals or future year forecasting adjustments done. I think that's something we're going to be looking at a little more for the next plan.
Cool. Thank you.
Hey Kyle, this is Adrita.
Hey,
so
Adrita.
I know you said that you're looking into other possible population synthesizers. So could you shed some more light on what those are and if those would include any interface, or would it be more coding based?
Yeah, so and I'd like to open this up to this group. The 3 primary ones that I've looked at is really the PopGen 2.0. It's got more capabilities, but it's just straight Python code, and so there's not a nice graphic user interface with it. It's more up to date, so some of the problems with how to install it and environments will probably be solved. Another one that I'm looking into is RSG has developed an open source population synthesizer. Again, I don't believe there's a nice, pretty GUI that's attached to it. Replica has one that they call Doppelganger, and we're going to look into that one too. But a lot of these are very, technically you just need to be able to do it in this coding and scripting or command line. So I'd be interested to hear this group if, say for any of the other MPOs, if you're using population synthesizers that you'd recommend as something that we should be looking into for this next MTP.
And would you guys be sharing like a survey at the end or something where we could make those suggestions, or you just expect us to keep in touch afterwards?
I think keep in touch or drop it in the chat would be great. We will have a survey as well, but I'm not sure that that will be one of the questions, since I think it's a very small group of people that are interested in population synthesizers.
Right.
Hey, Kyle.
Hi, Emil.
Hi, just a quick question. You mentioned the appendix and the data, the process for the land use update were updated recently. I just want to know the timeline to quickly check what I have is most up to date.
Yeah, so there has been a few changes. I think working with you on the Southeast Connector JPA project, they should be similar, but I'm going to release a new version of that tomorrow.
Okay, great. Good to know.
Yep.
Thanks.
And for everyone else, I'm referencing the spreadsheet versions that are really the data processing between these different tools to get the land use into Saxon format.
There is a spreadsheet for that. Just kidding. We have an extensive process in place, but like you've mentioned before as well, I think it would be nice to have a more streamlined process.
Yeah. All right. Anything else, or I think we can all go grab lunch before the next session. Like I mentioned, feel free to drop me an email or any additional questions. Happy to follow up on this. Bye, everyone.